a couple of things. Again, this is not a book, in the traditional sense, obviously. It's a kind of work, if you will. I titled it a prolegomena to, kind of first philosophy, which I think Mill Plateau fills out later, to a kind of postmodernism, post-psychoanalytic, post-orthodox Marxism, kind of approach to things. So in some ways, they are, in one way, it's maybe anticipating something we're living through today, and I want to keep that in mind as we go forward. I'll try to ground it better as we go on. I've been rereading Deleuze's great book on Spinoza, a formal book, which is called Spinoza's Theory of Expression, or Expressionism in English. It's a wonderful formal study of Spinoza's ethics, but the expression itself is also this relationship of speech to the outside and desire to the outside. And very, very much one of Deleuze's more impressive books in his treatment of figures in the history of philosophy. For those of you who don't know, he wrote on Henri Bergson as Bergsonianism, of which he takes a lot from in his cinema book. He also wrote, his first book is on empiricism and subjectivity, and Deleuze himself has called his practice a radical empiricism. He never thought of himself as a theorist, so to speak, but a radical empiricist, and in the tradition, if you will, of Hume. So subjectivity and empiricism, of course, the first book on, the second book on Nietzsche and philosophy, that is read very actively in philosophy departments, and created quite a movement around it in the 1980s, 1990s, early 1990s, of which there's been attacks upon it and a long history. And to mention Nietzsche too, I want to that the great book a lot of us have been anticipating will be out next month, Nietzsche, the Aristocratic Rebel, by Domenico Losordo, the great Italian historian and historian of philosophy. So that'll be out next month. It's going to be very different than Anti-Oedipus or Deleuze's reading, I promise you that. But again, a kind of way of rehistoricizing Nietzsche that'll be coming out. And again, this is all part of our current intellectual history, and there'll be a lot of paper on Losordo's book. It's been out in Italian, I think, for 10 years, right, Bruno? At least 10 years. I think 8 to 10 years. I know that Peter Thomas.
Yes, something like that.
Michael, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Peter Thomas tried to translate it. He gave up. He was in a major depression during that time trying to translate it. But anyway,
it's 1,000 pages, something like that. I had it. I lost it, but I bought it in Italy. Yeah.
You lost the book in Italy? It was too heavy?
No. When I moved, the last time I moved here, I lost it. I lost a few books, but I got it about 10 years ago in Italy. Yes.
Right. Yeah. I remember when it first came out. Right. So anyway, this would be maybe interesting. It may be out, and I'll try to get a gist of it and share with you whatever I can gather from it. I mean, I know something about it, but see if it fits at all with our work here. Losordo never really engaged psychoanalysis, and is I think a first-rate Italian Marxist in his way, a very different school of thinking, if you will. But anyway, to go back to Deleuze, so then the Spinoza book, which were lectures, in 1968, he published the book on expressionism in 1968. So, he taught Spinoza. You can actually access his lectures in French. I think they're available, in recorded form. And it's a very funny thing where he lights a cigarette and then he tells people to close the door. Right, so for the class, and
the Fold. A friend recommended The Fold.
Yeah, The Fold is a book on Leibniz. Yes, he also wrote on Leibniz. So Deleuze's expertise is far-ranging. right? Of course, Plato figures very much in the Difference and Repetition, also a book of 68. But Deleuze is extremely well published by this time, and just getting into the next phase of his philosophy during the writing of the Anti-Oedipus, whereas Guattari is basically a clinician, a militant clinician, and a militant, and obviously a very smart one, but not a quote professor of philosophy or a historian of philosophy, even though he knows this considerably. So again, I want us to keep this in mind. I also want us to keep in mind this is not the normal collaboration where you sit around and you try to, have a learned dialogue or, a kind of dialogical encounter. It's much more of flows. This is the crucial term, is really flow. This is what they're really trying to do. You can read this maybe as a flow book, if you want to look at it that way. The flows of, everything that they speak about early on, instead of the theater of the unconscious, the flow of the factory, right, etc. The flow of ideas, words, money, especially too, which is interesting too, how they kind of anticipate this incessant drive towards derivatives in the markets, and these kind of things that the circuit of M prime and capital that they're engaging. Another thing that I'm really finding here, and in case you haven't noticed, I like intertexts a lot, and one major intertext for me here is the Grundrisse, the sections on machines, pages 690 to 720, of which our friend Bruno here has written about in his book Labor of Fire, is maybe one of his starting points. And our friend Stanley Aronowitz has written on this chapter. The Jobless Future also takes its point of departure from that chapter, that long section in the Grundrisse. So I think this is in some ways at one level for the Marxists here, I use that term loosely, but anyway, that it's a kind of pretext in a way for Deleuze and Guattari. This could be really looked at as a long commentary, if you will, on that section in the Grundrisse, at one level. Also a long commentary on, traditional psychoanalysis and psychoanalysis as not really understanding delirium. This is one of their questions. Why do people, or how are people persuaded to desire their servitude rather than their freedom? How do we get to that point? That psychoanalysis for them, including Reich, even though Reich starts that movement, in terms of the mass psychology of fascism, psychoanalysis doesn't really understand because they're not interested in collective delirium so much, according to Deleuze and Guattari. I'm not saying that's always the case, but that's what they think. It doesn't see how it invests itself in the social field, how delirium is invested in the social field, and how it extends into that and into the exterior. And then also it doesn't understand that desire is more like a factory than a theater. That it's not really just the actors in history. It's also this play of the machine, not that becomes mechanistic, but becomes more machinic. So again, if we can keep these things in mind, I think we're going to maybe be able to dent this book, crack it a little more and more, or this flow book, maybe not a book, but a flow book, we could call it, in a sense, certainly an experiment, right, in a way. But I think there are many grounding, moments at the end when we get to schizoid analysis. So, and again, the two moments, right, that they're really attacking in today's, section that we're reading, and I have a couple of pages maybe we can start with, but the two aspects they're really critiquing in psychoanalysis, of course, is castration, the rock, if you will, of psychoanalysis, castration, anxiety, and Oedipus. And that they really find that ultimately, from their experience, again, I'm not saying this is always the case, but from their experience in the French scene, made in USA, ego psychology, what they were seeing at this time is that it pacifies and it modifies, and it basically, psychoanalysis always can be reintegrated somewhat back into the system. It has lost its subversive in its overturning capacity. So this is something that they really are about. For Deleuze, it becomes almost like a policing operation, the psychoanalyst. Yeah, Richard, please. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just going to say it's a historical moment that they're speaking in too, that I really only recently have become more aware of, which is that at this time, psychoanalysis is completely dominated by the United States. Psychoanalysis is almost like farming, the model of, that where Americans go and they quote unquote offer their way of farming to the rest of the world. Psychoanalysis had become really taken up by the American military during the Second World War at the end as a kind of cure for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. But it was a very strange and aberrant form of psychoanalysis, which we now know as ego psychology, led by Heinz Hartmann. And the first publication, in fact, of the American Psychoanalytic Association following the Second World War is entitled Ego Psychology by Heinz Hartmann. And it's very much about adaptation. It's, the idea is that it's not that you change anything. You have no political agency. You really are kind of adapting to the world around you. That's not to say there isn't this kind of, there is a kind of progressive side to some of its members who, dealing with racism and such. But nevertheless, the dominant model is American. And Lacan's use of his kind of opaque French is in part a resistance to this kind of dominant model of the IPA. And it's interesting, in reading the French, I'm aware that there's a slight, he's opposing Lacan too. He's at war with Lacan, but it's a different war and with a different final. But then there's also psychoanalysis as it's become this dominant model, which is where there's this model of an interpretation of castration and what it means, which is different than Lacan's, and also the centrality of Oedipus, which will be challenged by Lacan as well. But again, but at this particular moment, it's a real Trojan. Psychoanalysis is a Trojan horse in some ways of American imperialism.
Right, to Oedipus, right, to the gift of Oedipus, right?
Exactly.
The Trojan horse, right?
Yes.
Yes, very good. I'm just going to maybe just do a really short commentary on what you said, and thank you for that. Ernst Kreis, Heinz Hartmann, and Rudolf Lowenstein were the big three of ego psychology. They were all German immigrants, obviously, that came. They started the movement called ego psychology. New York-based, etc. Just to add to what Richard said, post 1945, there was, obviously with the State Department, the CIA, other agencies, all of this that were going on, there was a very, very concerted effort to control the social, right? And psychoanalysis was enlisted in this thing. It's not the system that is the problem. It is the self. The self must adapt in a way. And this was the beginning, of course, of adaptive, it's like, we're going to take your everyday misery and we're going to make it a little more funny so you can enjoy the Marx Brothers instead of Marx, right? You can see this playing out at many, many, many levels, in our society. At the same time, there were groups, who were left-leaning, also coming from Germany, right, or Austria, that came, such as Edith Jacobson, who was a communist, Otto Fenichel and his circle, the Round Circle on the West Coast. So all of these groups tried to continue the tradition of a kind of, if you will, Freudian, and I'm being very loose here with the terms, but a Freudian, Reichian, attempt synthesis right here, where the social and the psychic together are brought together. Psychic individualism is brought together with the social, of psychology. There was this mix. And of course, the Frankfurt School was very well aware of this in terms of its social psychology. So you did have these kind of small pockets, if you will, of resistance. And those of you that are practitioners in the room, you probably know the 50-minute hour by Linder, and A Rebel with a Cause, etc. And all the moments in American psychoanalytic, of course, the lay analysis of which was an American thing, it should not be controlled only by the medical doctors. It should be opened up, becoming a psychoanalyst. Remember, in the United States, the AMA was also controlling, psychoanalysis. You had to be a medical doctor. So, Freud was very good at intervening and really liberated. This was Theodore Reik, right? And of which listening with the third ear. And and there were very interesting interventions, as Richard was pointing out, on the race question, as well as on capital punishment. The compulsion to confess, a really good book by Theodore Reik. How some people, are forced into this kind of compulsion. Again, another kind of technique, if you will, of servitude, how these things are built from, very early on. So yes, so absolutely, this is a very much a part of the American appropriation of psychoanalysis and what it's become, etc. And most of the moment is really, yes, you need to learn how to cope better, and I'm going to help you to do that. I'm not going to help you, try to overturn, a very oppressive system, in your way and what you can do in your situation. So, Carl, yes, I see your hand up. I'm sorry.
This is sort of a question, in responding to what you were saying and what Richard was saying. I mean, I guess I read a lot of this section we're looking at this week as a critique of Freud, although they talk about a certain ambiguity or tension in Freud. Can I go beyond the father? Am I beholden to the father? But that, to use their language, kind of the Oedipal territorialization, or this sort of disciplining operation that they attribute to psychoanalysis. And I saw them locating this in Freud.
Yes.
As opposed to, I mean, it's that, and then it's kind of continued.
No. I'm in agreement with you, of course, and that's where they're going. I think what Richard and I were really trying to do is just historicize a little bit of this, how how this unfolded in the United States and how it became so dominant. And I guess most of you know that Lacan, Lacan was excommunicated, as he said, from the IPA, the International Psychoanalytic Association, on multiple grounds. He was dangerous, right? He understood, the short session, was maybe a productive moment in terms of the analytical account, or we can, talk about that as well. But anyway, all these things, Lacan was, he was kicked out, But unlike Reich, who was kicked out of the Analytic Association, as well as the Communist Party, Lacan was never a member, if you will, of the Communist Party, although he had many friends, and never really considered himself, even though, his rhetorical master was certainly Alexander Kojève, who was, an agent in France, and whose great lectures on Hegel are certainly worth reading and rereading. Going forward. So I think we're just trying to historicize, but I hear what you're saying in terms of the argument really here is that psychoanalysis has a lack itself, right? in its way. And we're also dealing here with questions, and I want to bring this up, the decolonization of therapy and how it's created and what it does in terms of, as you mentioned, territorialization and re-territorialization, even obviously on a global basis, right? And so this is another thing that's happening. And also with the factory as a notion of the unconscious, you can think of deterritorialization and re-territorialization very much what's going on during this period, and especially in the 70s when manufacturing is being outsourced, right? The West is no longer the sense of outsourcing. You have literal deterritorialization going on as well. So this book, I mean, to me, some of these terms can be used in a very productive, creative way outside of just the, what they meant to French psychoanalysis and French Marxism. Yeah, please, Carl. Go ahead.
Just a quick comment. As somebody who's done a lot of work and did my dissertation in the area of urban studies,
right,
territorialization and deterritorialization was heavily imported into radical geography. It became like yes. in some ways that I think was inappropriate, but it
probably yeah. No, I understand. Yeah. I mean, I had part of my growing up was in Baltimore, Maryland, so I saw a lot of that from Sparrows Point to the Wire. So it's more than just this concept here. So yeah. Anyway, anybody else want to make a comment? I mean, I this is kind of a way, a transition, if you will, to kind of put this in context. Yes, David, please. Yeah.
It's unmuting. Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah. I was really relating to what Carl was saying, where I was reading this as a strong critique of Freud, but it seems like this is complex, is in a way that there are so many Freuds. The interpretation of dreams, the Freud of 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, the Freud on the ego and the id. But the part they seem to not connect with in Freud, for whatever reasons, is in his later work, a lot has been written about the later Freud by a philosopher named Alan Bass, who translated a lot of Derrida.
Literary critic, yes, but he translated Derrida, yeah. Right. He's an extraordinarily gifted, person, yeah.
He's a smart one. A little crusty, but smart. But his work is a lot on the late Freud, on negation and fetishism.
Yes.
And that seems actually kind of aligned with this, where in his argument about it, where he feels Lacan is very connected, is that the fetishist is constantly oscillating between two indeterminate fantasies of castration, non-castration, and that the fantasy, rather than the fact of castration, which is the earlier kind of shibboleth in Freud castration, later on Freud kind of backtracks from that. And because it's an indeterminate, endless process of oscillations in the neurotic's mind between fetishistic structures, that does seem actually kind of like what I'm hearing them say, that there are these endless decodings and decodings, rather than I could see why they would be kind of anti-Hegelian or anti-earlier Freud, in that those earlier thinkers seem to say, you master the master-slave dialectic and there's a telos. You would master your neurotic complex and then there would be an end. The later Freud, like them, seems to postulate a kind of an indeterminate plateau of a kind of endlessness where it's all a more Nietzschean process of ascending and descending, becoming, non-becoming, finding meanings, rejecting them, and that you're sort of in this endless soup of ideas.
Right. No, very, very well put. I mean, and for those people that don't know, Alan Bass was the first translator of Jacques Derrida into English, writing Indifference. This is where he got his start. He became an analyst. He's practicing in New York. He teaches at the New School as well, and is an extraordinarily gifted, interpreter, both of Freud and, as you were mentioning, on the fetish and negation in the later Freud. And just to mention, there is a long discussion in the seminar. I forgot exactly which one. I think it's actually maybe in the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, or maybe even earlier, with Jean Hippolyte and Lacan on Verneinung, on negation, right, and denial. Yes, and it's a very interesting exchange of a Hegelian and a psychoanalyst. going back to that. But I think just to go back to Deleuze and especially Guattari in this context, I hear what you're saying, and I certainly agree. There are many Freuds. There's not just the Freud of castration and the discovery of the Oedipus complex in 1897, and this secret was revealed, in my dreams, etc. But I think again they're again trying to get outside of the language of psychoanalysis. They're really trying to create neologism that they think still you're trapped within the neurotic, right? You're still treating neurosis and treating the neurotic. So I mean, this opens up a lot of problematic spaces, of course, right, for inquiry. But for them, it's not the neurotic that really interests them at this point. Psychoanalysis is for neurosis. It's for psychosis to a degree, although Freud did not like to go near psychotic patients. And really, in a way, they thought in some ways, and this is open to discussion too, for maybe the clinicians here or people that are, going to write something, does Lacan actually try to Oedipalize schizophrenia? Ultimately, does he do this again? So this is some of their stakes. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not, agreeing or disagreeing, just trying to keep the quote unquote flow book going here in a sense. But please tell me more, Dave. I mean, this is very, very interesting that both you and Carl as an introduction to this section, which is, I think, an attack on Freud. It is, a frontal attack in many ways.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's just curious, and maybe this is part of it, is that in kind of thinking of the various people like the ego psychologists, it feels like part of the notion of the adaptation relates to the economic problem of masochism, period Freud, as I see it, in that it feels like if you kind of, quotes as the ego psychologists put it, you submit to the dictates of external reality. In that kind of thinking, which I think is a little bit of a distortion of Freud, even at, we could say, perversion 2, the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, which says you must submit to the patriarchal order and behave, it feels like it's a way that it makes psychoanalysis really dangerously a form of social control.
I see. Yeah.
And I think it's understandable they're hooked into that because that's something to rebel against. Who wants social control? You go to the couch to loosen up and live your life and dance around mountains and be ideally more Nietzschean. But I'm just curious, for hagiographic reasons, were they aware of the later Freud but chose to kind of avoid civilization and its discontents, where he says only the weak succumb to the bourgeois herd mentality? Was there a reason they pushed that aside in what they were doing? Why have they?
Yeah. No, it's a very good point. I don't know really a direct answer to that question. I will say again that this was really an attempt to get to a new biologics, if you will, as well with the use of molecular revolution in Guattari's work. That they're trying to get to a neologism. Their way of going about this is very similar in some ways to Freud's career, where the meta-psychological, in their case, the meta-schizoid analysis becomes global. If you look at Mill Plateau in 1980, and I know we're not doing it, but the Mill Plateau is kind of a global encounter with war, nomad thinking, births of civilization, birth of linguistics, etc. Again, so, a thing that they have that I think is important to remember is they have Gregory Bateson. They have a lot of the, technological advances of the time, the technological machines, right, that they're looking at. And in a way, they're trying to, I think, again, synthesize this into a new kind of, attempt, but at the same time, looking at the double messaging, what's happening, how this feeds what Deleuze takes up from Burroughs, the society of control, right? How this is feeding that, and that seems to me to be always what they're against, in a sense. But I think I don't know the answer. You know, if they really knew. I'm sure they knew. Look, you know, again, these are guys that are highly educated, and
Sure.
you know, they obviously have read The Future of an Illusion, you know, Totem and Taboo, you know, and there are many ways of reading Totem and Taboo. And speaking of which, in Weekend, the last sequence is Totem and Taboo, by the way. You know, it's a play on that in Godard's film, and he keeps flashing Totem and Taboo on the screen. So, you know, again, the metapsychological works of Freud are really known. You know, of course, Civilization and its discontents, its malcontents too. So, you know, again, I think we're in the presence. I mean, part of the problem probably, I mean, here is that there are a lot of neologisms that are being taken up, but they want to get away from just, you know, Freudian desire and even Lacanian desire, right? This for them, or Hegelian desire, or Kojevian desire, or Sartrean desire in this way. And they want to talk about this in terms of desiring machines. You know, they want to get outside of the Marxist distinctions between relations and forces of production. You know, in some ways, they want to look at this as a very different homo natura, if you will, right? In the sense, right? You know, this is much more about nature for them, yeah, and a kind of echo, you know, if you will, psychology, if you want to, if we could put it that way. You know, and the beginning of this schizoid analysis. But please continue. This is very rich, at least to my mind. Yeah, Carl. Yeah.
This is to David and to any of our other experts on Freud. I mean, I was doing a little crash course reading some Freud this week, and it seemed to me like in some of the earlier work that I read, like his summary of the interpretation of dreams, 1901, and his writing on the
1900. He had the ego to publish it at the turn of the century. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Like I was seeing things that it did almost seem more like desiring machines, and at least in these essays, he's not talking a lot about Oedipus. He's sort of laying out this more what he calls a dynamical or a topological theory of the
right. Sure.
As I understood reading their text, that it's really with the ego and the id that he sort of turns to this more structural model. And at that point, they're saying that Oedipus becomes more central to his work. And I'm wondering if other people concur with that. And then, David, you're saying that later on he kind of moves away from that in a certain way. So,
right.
So
right.
Can I also?
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, Bruno. Yeah, please interject. Yeah. Well,
I mean, in agreement with Carl and David, right? But I want to add that what I found particularly interesting, among other things, is their critique of psychoanalysis as a metaphysics, right? And they say the unconscious is the metaphysics of psychoanalysis. And then later they say toward the end of what we are reading today, the unconscious, right? The function of the unconscious is to insert desire in the triangulation and then to prohibit desire at the same time. That's where the double bind then comes in. So what I found particularly interesting, because there is a very subtle, and there are references to Immanuel Kant, but it could be to John Duns Scotus, the subtle doctor, moment in which they review the different logics of either or when they speak about the connective synthesis, disjunctive synthesis, right? The either or that they get rid of. Or, I mean, if you will, the either or is almost like in logic, like the logic of identity, right? And then they focus on the either or, which is the could of possibilities in the plural. I mean, very often we forget the difference also between, say, the modal can and the modal could in English, right? Can is possibility, could is possibilities, or. And Deleuze says that in difference and repetition also. I mean, speaking about this either or. logic, which is very close to the logic of the great metaphysician from the Middle Ages, Duns Scotus, but they refer to Kant. And so they apply the moment in which they go into the question of transcendence and immanence, and then the transcendental. So they say there is a transcendental unconscious. That's what they want to propose in a sense, replacing with that the transcendent unconscious, typical of all metaphysics, you know, that as Heidegger says in his work on Nietzsche, it goes from Plato to Nietzsche himself, brings that, right? In a sense, there is a similar moment that they are doing with Freud. Freud completes something, but he still remains within the metaphysics of transcendence. So the point is to exit that in a schizoid way. I mean, the schizoid psychoanalysis, schizoid moment that they propose is precisely that of the transcendental, that whereby one is not captured and trapped within the either or, either this or that, but there is this openness of infinite, if you will, possibilities, either this or that could. It could be this or it could be that, and so on and so forth, never to put an end to this explosion of possibilities, which, as we know, we spoke so many times about contingency. This is pure contingency, right, that they're talking about. I mean, these are the, I can call attention to the pages where they had these wonderful moments. I can do it now if you want, but that's...
Well, let's let David reply to Carl. And I mean, this is a very good, to my mind, it's got people really thinking, you know, within their, you know, yeah, this is great. I mean, you know, it's a very, very good start to a very, again, difficult chapter. So, yes. So, yeah, back to with Freud, you know, alongside Deleuze and Guattari. Through you, David, I guess we could narrativize this a little bit. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I think, you know, this is all a little over my head, frankly. I'm more of a clinician, not so much a philosopher. But it does seem to me in the later Freud, we could say, to go back to Carl's point, in the ego and the id, it's a little bit more about horizontal repression. And so what The Family Made You Sick in was saying you had to repress something.
Right.
And the repressive force is generating a tremendous degree of disturbance. In the later Freud, it's less about the horizontal splitting of saying something is down there, it's like a foreign body, you've got to kind of get that trauma out and you could understand it, and then there would be a telos. The later Freud is much more interested in what we would call vertical splitting of the ego, meaning, again, there's the oscillation between two fantasy systems, the fantasy of castration, the fantasy of non-castration. So in being in that later mode of vertical splitting, we see this so much in the kind of, quotes, meta qualities of the fiction of Henry James. I think in modern cinema, you know, it's been kind of interesting in a film like Fight Club.
Montage analytic.
Montage. But
montage is an excellent example.
The subject, like if we think of, say, a story like The Turn of the Screw, the person is very connected to this fantasy that the children are evil.
Right.
But what if they're mad and the children are fine? But then again, the children seem evil. But then again, what if you're mad? So it feels like, while it's this conundrum where you could wind up in this vertical split where you don't go anywhere, it does actually seem like it's kind of like what they are getting at, which is to say, if you could embrace that reality is not definitively known, and work it, and go through the multiple decoding, you might have an actually more adaptive system that says you're aware that your fantasies can shift and adapt in a way that creates the reality as opposed to submitting to it.
That's a very good point. I mean, I think if Guattari was here, he would certainly agree with you, because a lot of his work was done on group fantasies as you just presented that. You know, he really was very interested in group fantasies and how they then become projected onto the world and working with that level. So yeah, I mean, very, very, very good again. Yeah. But I want to emphasize, and Bruno put this, I mean, the schizoid in a way is both a symptom, but also a revolutionary here in
Mhm.
terms of this work, right? And that the schizoid is the figure, if you will, in a sense, and which you referred to as the Splattung, the splitting of the subject that Freud is very good at later in the vertical splitting. That this schizoid becomes kind of the figure that cannot be represented, right, in the immediate, is this kind of contingency, as Bruno said, of the open possibility or the open space, right, philosophically speaking, but also, I think, if you will, psychologically thinking. I'm not as crazy about, I'm more with Freud about philosophers. Nietzsche ended up and said, psychology is the queen of the sciences. He kind of, I think it's an interesting remark, but yes, yeah. But Deleuze obviously holds on to the language of philosophy. Guattari is not so much there in this work. So yeah, Richard, you wanted to say something? Yeah, I know this is very good. Yeah.
Just about again, in terms of I mean, one word that Lacan obviously uses is he wants to go back and to reread Freud, and
right.
The thing is, people are going back to Freud and finding different things. There's this Strachey translation, which is the standard American translation, that takes these words in German, which are very common everyday words,
Right.
like I, das Ich, and becomes ego, and makes them into English, into these Latin terms that in a way makes it more of a quote unquote scientific text. So when Lacan talks about reading, it's about a kind of fluidity. But what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, and I think the idea is about revolution. They're in the space of the psychotic, and the space of the psychotic is a place where, as you pointed out, Freud was not comfortable. The one text is the Schreber, whom he never met, that he's analyzing in a sense through the text of Schreber, and they're in a clinical setting where they're among people with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And I've, as a non-clinician, I've just working as a volunteer, I've had an opportunity, and it's a feeling of a kind of liberation, or that you're going somewhere where Freud didn't go. And I think their reading of Freud, why they choose a certain Freud or a different Freud, and were they aware of text? In a way, there's a bit of, I think, I hate to mention Howard Bloom, but anxiety of influence. And, they set up, they're setting up a revolutionary action. And the Freud they choose is the dominant American model. But rather than going and rereading, I think they really want to use this as a catalyst for revolutionary change. And so that also has something to do with their choice of these particularly imperialistic, let us say, qualities. I don't know if we want to say Freud's text, but the way that the Freudians at that time were using Freud's work as, again, part of this Americanization of mental health care that was beginning to take place in the post-war period. So I think they choose enough said.
Okay. Yes, Chris. Yeah, I see you waving.
I've been wanting
to
add something to what Bruno had said when he talked about the disjunctive. The third part is the conjunctive synthesis. And that brings in, if you want to talk about imperialism, the coding that the Deleuze and Guattari referred to. And we're now in the realm of law and the state. and the controlling part of analysis with the conjunctive synthesis. That's all I wanted to say about that, that there's a third part which brings in courts and law and what Foucault would call dispositif or discourse.
Dispositif, yeah.
Sorry, Chris, and we will do that next time, right? The conjunctive synthesis.
Yeah.
I believe it's in the next section.
Yeah. And I,
yeah, right. But if I may add one thing only, because the schizoid is also very interestingly has the configuration of refusal as well, because if I may, because I forgot earlier, add to the logics of either or, and then either or, then there is the exclusive disjunction of neither nor.
Right.
That's,
right.
Wonderful,
So,
wonderful.
Yes. No, they're very good at this.
And the pages are 76, 77, 78, 79 for someone else.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Yeah, no, I want to go there, definitely. Yes, Carl. Yeah.
So to me, I guess, there's reference to text. Something that struck me a lot in terms of this is that I think it's, let me just find the page. It's, I think 74, where, so they've sort of, they've established their conception of desiring, and then they, refer to the Oedipalization that takes place through psychoanalysis. And then they say, we're not denying that Oedipus exists or that there are castration anxieties, but they deny that there are productions of the unconscious. But they also have said on a page before that we don't really know how, what forces constellate Oedipus. So it seems like, I guess to me it was a little unclear. It doesn't seem like they really have a very coherent theory, maybe, of how Oedipus, I mean, it almost seems like they're attributing, on the one hand, the Oedipal moment as an operation of psychoanalysis, that psychoanalysis is almost constituting and imposing Oedipus on something that is not fundamentally Oedipus, that the unconscious is not Oedipal. I think they're trying to make that very strong assertion. And then they make a certain critique that once you transpose desire into Oedipus, everything becomes about representation, not production, and you divest the social field of desire. I think that's like one of their big critiques. Is that
Let me just go to the text for a second regarding, I think that give us maybe something about this Oedipus moment in psychoanalysis. If you turn to page 55, psychoanalysis is like the Russian Revolution. We don't know when it started going bad. We have to keep going back further to the Americans, one, which Richard opened with, to the First International, which, we can certainly go on and on about in schisms, etc., to the Secret Committee, to the original committee, to the first ruptures, which signify renunciations by Freud as much as by betrayals by those who break with him, to Freud himself from the moment of the discovery of Oedipus, ? So they're raising very interesting questions here. Oedipus is the idealist turning point, going back to what Bruno said, the kind of transcendentalist idealist moment, the turning point, right? Yet it cannot be said that psychoanalysts set to work unaware of desiring production. So they're giving, credit, this kind of credit to psychoanalysis. The fundamental notions of an economy of desire, work and investment keep their importance, but are subordinated to the forms of an expressive unconscious and no longer to the formation of the productive unconscious. The an-Oedipal nature of desiring production remains present, but it is fitted over the coordinates of Oedipus, which it translates into pre-Oedipal, para-Oedipal, quasi-Oedipal, etc. The desiring machines are always there, but they no longer function except behind the consulting room walls. Interesting, that this is put in there. Behind the walls or in the wings, such as in the place, the primal fantasy concedes to desiring machines when it reduces everything to the Oedipal scene. They continue nonetheless to make a hellish racket. Even the psychoanalyst can't ignore them. He tends, therefore, to maintain an attitude of denial. All that is surely true, but it is still daddy, mommy. Over the consulting room door is written, leave your desiring machines at that door. Give up your orphan and celibate machines, your tape recorder and your little bike, enter and allow yourself to be Oedipalized. So this is the beginning of their critique. This is the 1897 Freud, to go back where David, there are multiple Freuds, obviously, and there are many, many changes and revisions that go through in his work. And this is, obviously a master thinker and someone who never stayed stuck, in his own, theories. He's always in revision, right? And throwing things into question. Everything follows from that, beginning with the untellable character of the cure. It's interminable, going back to, what Hans Sachs, analysis never ends, right, etc., interminable analysis, and highly contractual nature, flows of speech in exchange for flows of money. Mm-hmm. So going back to this flow, right, in a sense, right, in a way. All that is needed is what is called a psychotic episode. After a schizophrenic flash, one day we bring our tape recorder into the analyst's office. With the insertion of a desiring machine, everything is reversed. We have broken the contract. We are not faithful to the major principle of the exclusion of a third party. We have introduced a third element, the desiring machine in person. Now, this is a reading of something that created great controversy in France at the time, of which Sartre somewhat was behind. The Jean-Jacques Abraham thing, the man with the tape recorder that goes into the office and basically says, see, I told you it's true. You want me to always be in the triangulation of daddy, mommy, me. It's in the footnote, the name of the tape recorder, a psychoanalytic dialogue. And this was published by Temps Moderne and, of course, created quite a stir, including a real rift between Sartre and his friend Pontalis, the psychoanalyst. But anyway, okay, so that every psychoanalyst should know, underneath Oedipus, through Oedipus, behind Oedipus, his business is really with desiring machines. So they're making their case very early. Why didn't we just call this desiring machines instead of, the imperialism or Oedipus, etc.? Why does this come out? At the beginning, psychoanalysis could not be unaware of the forcing employed to introduce Oedipus, to inject it into the unconscious. Then Oedipus fell back on and appropriated desiring production as if the productive forces emanated from Oedipus itself. The psychoanalyst became the carrier of Oedipus, or the avatar, or whatever, the great agent of anti-production in desire. The same history as that of Capital, with its enchanted, miraculated world, going back to the fetish that David mentioned. Of course, the first chapter of Capital Volume 1 is about the fetishism of the commodity. And fetish, fetizo in Portuguese really means to give magical properties to something, right? In that way. Okay, so the only history is that which is an enchanted, miraculated world. So also at the beginning, said Marx, the first capitalist could not be unaware of the magical properties of the commodity. Yes, let's give something, to the Native Americans. Let's do this. I don't know if you remember. I live in cinema half the time, but anyway, remember the wonderful scene in Aguirre, Wrath of God, when Klaus Kinski is on the boat in the Amazon with the natives that are being unalized, and they give them the Bible, and the natives are putting it up to ear. They can't hear anything. They keep shaking, right? They can't be Christianized. So hilarious scene in Aguirre, Wrath of God, which I think's changed, of course, our perspective in cinema. One of its great moments.
In some sense, assume what they need to show.
Yes, it does. It's a crucial passage for today's discussion. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you. Go ahead.
Oh, I would imagine that a more orthodox approach would be to say, we don't, dispute your theory of the pre-Oedipal unconscious, but a transformation does take place as the child begins to form object relations with what they refer to as global persons, that there is certain syntheses and integrations going on, and that we have just discovered these things, and these are the real transformations that when the adult finally walks into our office, we can't directly go back to the desiring machine because the desiring machine doesn't exist in that format. I think, and there is another passage with.
Well, they're introducing again this language of desiring machine into the vocabulary, really, in a way. Yeah. They say, what a mistake to have said Oedipus. What a mistake it was to say, this word. What a mistake it was to, territorialize around or triangulate around daddy, mommy, me, because desiring production is a much more a productive way of looking at the question of desire. And thank you to Beryl, by the way. It's excellent to hear Deleuze's 24-minute, it's in French, but, struggle with it, or you can do the translation machine, but his great, sessions with his mistress, Claire Parnay, who you never see, you only see the back of her head and you see Deleuze, although she's chain smoking throughout it, which is funny. But anyway, it's really great. Deleuze is talking about desire for 24 minutes, and it's on the website. Thank you for Beryl to get this from Abaker, his interviews based on the alphabet, beginning with animal. Right. And yeah, anyway. So I think they're basically introducing their vocabulary here vis-a-vis where psychoanalysis was not unaware of this, but they chose a different path. And, when we go back to this, why choose Oedipus? Well, think about it this way. The revised German model under which Freud was educated, right, etc. Freud's brother-in-law, Bernays, another Bernays, not the one that did propaganda here and was the master of public relation. Another one won the Goethe Prize for the award of best essay on Antigone, which could also be seen as another founding document, as some of the Foucaultians and others have thought that Antigone, really the hysterical woman, right, in a sense, is the founding moment of psychoanalysis, and not Oedipus, right, in a way. So they're very good book, including John Roshman, who lives in New York. Some of you may know him. Wrote a very good book on Eros and Antigone, as a founding document. And of course, Lacan, has long sections on this. So we have to remember, how are these people educated too? I mean, as well as ourselves. What are we bringing in terms of the own prejudice? What is being brought to the table here? And in Freud's case, this is a classical education. This is a man immersed in the Greek and the Roman, understood myths, et cetera, et cetera. And another antagonist here in some ways, and we go back to structural anthropology. Levi-Strauss, where the Oedipus myth can be applied, complex, or in terms of myth, can be applied universally.
Yes, he was trying to prove the universality of the incest taboo.
The incest taboo, exactly. Yeah, which comes back to,
prove that it was universal with diagrams of Brazilian bodywork and tattoos.
Right.
Michael.
So, please. I was waiting for you. I'm here ready to hear. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Just that the vocabulary of desiring machines. And territorialization, deterritorialization. That's actually not new. That's a retranslation of the Freudian vocabulary. So they are directly reading and rewriting in according to, actually, I think, the same essay that Lacan claims to have rewritten and rediscovered the original Freud through condensation and displacement. So their condensation and displacement is the flows and the productions, the producing machines. they're desymbolizing it. Their primary objection seems to be about representation. Right.
Right. No, I hear you, but for them, the language of symbol, and going back to where David, began, and Carl too, in terms of the interpretation of dreams and the early Freud, for them, this interpretive model, this is not an interpretive model. This is a model that is trying to be anti-interpretive.
Exactly, and Freud also began as a neurologist.
Yes, absolutely.
He was looking for the electrical charges of the body, and that language is directly transposed into those early chapters.
Okay, yes, of course. I mean, this is Helmholtzian. This is all part of the German, model of physics, and he really tried to say that this is a science. This is how he wanted to ground it, and he was using many of those models of energetics in the 19th century to prove that there is such a thing as not an unconscious motivation, how the dynamics work, etc. And he built, as Carl was mentioning earlier, the topography of the mind, right, as well as the structural elements that David spoke to in terms of the vertical splitting in the end. And
he built a model of desiring machines.
Okay, well, maybe model. Yeah, okay, fair enough.
And the word cathectus.
You're doing exactly what they're trying to fight against. You're bringing them back into the fold and saying, sit down, we had this down to begin with. Of course, you're telling us nothing new. That's what if we only return this to Freud. I think we should look to see what's different. Yeah, go ahead, Carl. I'm sorry. Yeah,
it seems to me again that the critical moment in all this is the question of Oedipus and its role and its the triangulation, and they also reference Melanie Klein and the partial object, and the partial object seems to me to be sort of central to how they understand the desiring machine, how it produces, it's cutting, it's intercepting, it's connecting, and there's all these objects that are emerging. But then their critique of Melanie Klein is that she once again re-Oedipalizes the subject, right? And that so it seems like that's kind of the critical question. I mean,
ideality of Oedipus is what is really at question here. They're really honed in on the way that this supplants all the rest of the creative juice and genius of the desiring machines of psychoanalysis. It's this singular focus, which seems to be true. It's borne out in history that this took over as the symbol for Freud when he was collecting his followers. And so she also falls sway to this inability to get out from under it. That seems to be their primary critique of Klein, and throughout this chapter.
Yeah, they seem to like her work a lot on one level. They seem to, reference it to the partial object.
Right. David, do you want to add to this? And then Richard, please.
Yeah, I was really resonating with the idea of Klein in that it does seem there's a lot of her work that looks at, we were looking at it, I think 2 classes ago, the sense of the scooped out body of, in her model, the infant being so filled with a desire that's destructive that the only way the child can tolerate it is to see it directed towards not so much only the part object, but the emptied object. The mother's good things, her vulva, uterus, breasts, the inner workings that the epistemophilic impulse to know would devour, tear apart, all of those things, creates a kind of faux fantasy of the mother as the scooped out thing that can therefore be attacked because it's safe, and the object connection and the libidinal urge to know can be kind of preserved in this delicate equilibrium. I think that they're really resonating as I read them with that part of Klein of saying, to tolerate being a desiring machine, you're in this very uneasy relationship to an object that could very easily be destroyed by you. That for them, there's something about this where what this is being directed towards, it could be very dangerous. So where the desire could go is quite complicated, because it doesn't feel for them, as I read them, and again, I'm a novice to them, as it establishing a really stable interpenetration of two different energetic systems, the way Reich would have seen the healthy mother nursing a baby, or more benign psychologists like Winnicott would have said, no, it's all benign, and the mother really is in this beautiful dyad and rapture with the baby. They seem in a radical way to get Klein's sense of saying the aggression can really go off the rails.
Right, right.
We need to
And
take
again, I mean, to go back to this kind of re-Oedipalization, if you look at pages 45 and 46, the Klein moment is also taken up as an advance, but at the same time, desiring production is brought back to Oedipalization. Again, that's what they're trying to resist, if you will. This is a grand resistance of theirs, right, in a way. That the child said, tell me a little bit about your desiring machines, but the kid screams, answer daddy and mommy when I speak to you, right, kind of thing. So again, this is another, moment of the speech act, and also this kind of re-Oedipalization that they see throughout the history of the movement, no matter who was, involved at this point. But yeah, you explained it very well. This is, Dick is inside Dark Mummy, right?
Exactly.
It's a very beautiful descriptive, just for people that are interested in Melanie Klein. This is taken on pages 45 and 46, and how the partial drive and the partial objects are re-Oedipalized, if you will. Yes, Richard.
Then on 47, it talks along with the partial objects and their the connections of the desiring machines into each other, connected to parts of his body. And the primary beef about that situation seems to be that a partial object is not representing a parent, not representing a person or a family, that those things are in and of themselves elements in the desiring machine. It seems like it's got a very Kleinian feel to it, and the mechanisms of Klein are all there. The primary beef seems to be that this is not a substitute for a person. It doesn't represent a person. This is not a representational system.
No, it's certainly not. Yeah.
And she seems to comply with the orthodoxy that it must be.
Yes, exactly. Well put. Very good. Yes, Richard. Yeah.
This is an, psychiatry. It's hard for us to realize that also at this time, psychiatry was completely enamored of psychoanalysis. Psychiatrists used to be called superintendents, and it was the most lucrative branch of medicine. And then they were critiqued for this concentration in psychiatric hospitals. And it was really after the Second World War, on the model of treating soldiers as part of their units, that they then became identified with treating neurosis. And this was seen as a way of treating the rising middle class. They moved. So this is a moment when there's a transition from treating the patient population of psychosis in the hospitals to treating the patient population of the American public. The first National Institute of the NIMH is formed in 46. Mental Health Act is 45, 46. This the DSM, the first one, which comes out of a nosology for soldiers and establishes this idea of the civilian population as like at war, the Cold War. That metaphor is from the very beginning in the DSM. So this patient population also is one where, all of psychiatry, which is facilitated by the language, at least the language and the terminology of psychoanalysis, the shifts from one patient population to the patient population of the bourgeoisie. And so, and as we'll see afterwards, the psychotics are left on the streets as they are today in the prisons. With no or minimal care. So for them to focus also at this moment on psychosis, on the psychotic, is at a moment when the rest, psychoanalysis at this moment is the Google stock of psychiatry. I mean, it becomes saturated in the culture. In Hollywood, takes it up. Talk show hosts talk about their psychoanalyses in the United States, and at the same time, again, the people who they're focusing on are a patient population that will be more and more abandoned. So, there's also that political aspect of working with this group of people at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. And again, another read on this would be in terms of the American and the Americanization of psychoanalysis. If you look at film and TV programs during the 1950s up until the 60s, psychological realism is the moment of the day. This is going on in theater, this is going on in cinema, etc. So this depth psychology is very dominant during this period. The problem, once again, and I think Deleuze and Guattari, and what we're missing, I know we've been very focused, and it's good that we're looking at this because Freud is obviously very, very important, but they're again trying to look at the socius, right? There's nothing but the socius to them. They're always beginning from the outside, right? This is not an interiorization. Again, why they talk about in the beginning, the schizoid on a stroll is much more interesting than the neurotic on the couch within the walls, right? This another thing that they're really trying to do. So, I mean, if we can read this, yes, culturally and historically, and as you said, the patient population, and as you know, there were some very high-powered, long-term, psychoanalytically driven clinics here, people that would take respites, right, in the United States, as well. We can begin to see, how this plays out in the arts, how this plays out in the culture at large, in many ways. And who are the filmmakers? What do we have in the filmmakers in this period? We have the new wave. We have Purple Noon of René Clément. Look at this too in terms of French cinema, and French cinema being the birth of film noir too. And at the same time, these experiments that go on in the new wave, particularly around Godard, and what this book, or this flow book, can actually indicate, beyond that of our quote American scene and maybe what they're doing, even though Deleuze is very, very much involved with the American scene. He loves Burroughs. He loves Henry Miller. He wrote a book. He wrote a very good essay on Herman Melville. So, it's not like he's anathema. You remember the passages from D.H. Lawrence here. So again, what we're doing, in a sense, we have to keep in mind there are other parallel aspects going on in this text, which are listening to the artists, listening to the ones that can be Oedipalized, re-territorialized, et cetera. I don't know if you know Gostiolo, Juan Gostiolo, the Spanish writer, but Juan the Landless is an attempt to decode Spanish language. It's about nomadic, deterritorialization, things that cannot be back-coded, in a sense. So I think this is important to keep these levels in mind. And, going back to the film, Matt put Antonioni in the thing. You look at some of that architectonic of Antonioni's cinema too. It's also something that is extremely subversive for the time that we're talking about. So, and yes, you're right, Richard. Psychoanalysis was dominant in conversation from the 70s on. And one of the famous essays, and maybe some people remember this, Frederick Cruz, professor of English at University of California at Berkeley, spoke to the revolts of the 60s, the student revolts, were an Oedipal conflict, and this was the conservative approach. You have problems, go see the therapist, right? This has nothing to do with the social. This is your family drama, your family romance playing out. So in a way, the system was very active in being able to use this. And during times of social upheaval, I want to say that, I mean, I've looked at this for a long time. I want to say during times of real social upheaval and where there's a possibility for somehow Freud appears on the scene and is used in such a way to go back to a form of social control. And we have to admit that to ourselves. Nothing, about Freud himself, right? In terms of, because, anybody that can say when he crosses the German border into France, when he's asked, how did you find the Gestapo? He says, oh, I highly recommend them. This was a great sense of humor and a very subversive mind. And I don't read German, but from what I gather, from both conversation with a friend, this is a man who loved a good joke more than anything, and a book that's forgotten, jokes in the unconscious. But at the same time, I'm looking at the use value of this, how it's used socially too. And I think they're very much aware of this passage I wrote. What went wrong in the movement? What went wrong in the psychoanalytic movement? What went wrong in the communist movement, right? The two most progressive movements of the 20th century, if you will. And what happened to, So in a way, I think they're positioning themselves as a kind of new, look, they don't say this about themselves, but a new avant-garde, if you will, an experimental avant-garde. Yeah. So Carl, I see you're ready to.
I appreciate you raising, because I was, it gets to what is their project beyond just, this sort of gripe against traditional psychoanalysis.
I don't think it's singular. I think it's, it's projects. I'm sorry.
One of the things that I thought was very interesting is this is on page 62, 63, where they talk about group fantasy and individual fantasy. And maybe I do not totally understand the reference to this clinic but they seem, there's this where they're talking about the individual, sort of the isolated, and psychoanalysis and is very much an operation or a practice that you're alone on the couch with yourself, your fantasy.
Yeah, and what actually here? I mean, is it the because he's actually this is Guattari speaking. If it's page, is it page 63 or 2 and 3 you're speaking?
No, this is page 62.
Yeah.
At least on my copy, and it's the paragraph that begins with when the notion of group fantasy, and then later they're talking about individual fantasy plugged into the existing social field, but apprehends it in the form of imaginary qualities that confer on it a kind of transcend. And I think that gets also at some of what Bruno was getting at. But then they seem to pose that against this is bottom of this page, the revolutionary pole of group fantasy becomes visible, on the contrary, in the power to experience institutions themselves as mortal, to destroy them or change them according to the articulations of desire in the social field. So they want to revest, the social field with desire. And the way I read this is that this isn't ultimately about supporting a bunch of artists, that ultimately this is about collective practice, and that it's sort of like overcoming this dichotomy. So I sort of almost transpose this in my mind, is that, sort of the group fantasy becomes the place where the desiring machine is transposed and reappears. That's kind of how I read this.
As a collective project, yes.
That it's not really, I think that they're sort of, I don't really think that they're talking about we should all just decompose ourselves into these,
Well, I think one part of the sentence, I understand. One part of the sentence you left out that I think Richard can do a good commentary on, since this is one of his things, is that by making the death drive, it's not instinct, bad translation, I did check this, death drive into a variable institutional creativity. And it seems to me this is one of the more subversive aspects of both Lacan and Freud, or Lacan's rereading of Freud. How does one use the death drive creatively in the institutional and in this subversive sense? Yeah, Richard, you want to say something? This is a
I accept to agree. I don't feel sufficiently
okay.
But absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, it's something I'm very interested in myself in terms of the death drive and repetition in their work. So I would just agree with you.
Okay. So I mean, yeah. So in a way, the distinguishes the revolutionary institution from the enormous inertia which we are experiencing today. I mean, this book to me is becoming more and more prescient in terms of its critiques of inertia, institutions, all these levels of regress that we've gone through, under, for lack of a better term, late liberalism, neoliberalism, hyper-industrial capital, whatever. But anyway, which the law communicates to institution and an established order. And then they go on to Nietzsche again, who's always present here, I think. And this is Deleuze speaking more than Guattari. Guattari is about the group fantasy because this was their work at Laborde Clinic. This was their clinical work. But as Nietzsche says, churches, armies, the states, which of these all dogs want to die, right? In a way. So how do you put this to death? And this is interesting that you bring this up, Carl, because this is the beginning of what the revolutionary is. The pole of group fantasy becomes visible, is the power to experience institutions themselves as mortal. This inevitability, that's the way it is. All of these things that go on in everyday life in terms of, our practices, they're critiquing this. Yeah, they're saying we have to take risks beyond, quote unquote, the Oedipal, or to use, Bruno's, term from philosophy, contingency. We have to understand that we are contingent beings, that we need to take, in Mick Jagger's word, take a chance on a chance. You got to roll them, in a sense, or Mallarmé, every revolution is a throw of the
a law of chance.
Yes, exactly. So I think this is where they're going, in a sense, that somehow the institution of psychoanalysis, as Richard began today, and we in various ways have critiqued, is really at a stalemate, right? It has hit this conundrum, it has hit this aporia, and they're trying to break through. Whether they do so successfully, but the attempt is to think from the outside back in. Not from the inside. We need to modify this. We need to, change this a little bit.
More fatigue. Nietzsche's amor fati.
Yes, amor fatum, right? The love of the factual, the love of facticity. Yeah. No, I know it's fati, but the fatum is the important part there, I think, the love of what presents itself to us. Right? Not just fate.
We'll return to that again.
Yes, we will, of course. Yes. Okay. Of course. Yeah. So but this is a very good passage because this section here that you're referring to, Carl, is about the group fantasy, and its transposition, if you will, into revolutionary desire. Again, the object of the book at one level, and one of its objectives, is to say, look, we want to get out, and one of the reasons for the title of the course, Overcoming Servitude, whether we do or not is another story, but they're really, again, asking this very radical question: how do we put ourselves into the position where we actually desire Joe Biden? In a certain way. And we now desire lesser of two evils. How do we get to these points, in a sense? This is their kind of radical question. What mechanisms, what is happening in the socius that produces this? That ultimately that Germany can be passive before Adolf Hitler for, almost 10 years, even though there's many attempts to take him out, etc.
Deleuze wrote about masochism first, early in his career.
Yeah. No, I know. David, you wanted to say something? I saw your screen go on for,
Oh, no, I'm just taking it in. There's a lot.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just, I'm riffing on, what I see as a fundamental problem that they're trying to address. Yes.
No, just a quick thing, because that was from page 63, no? That you read the last.
62 and 63.
Right. But then the top of page 64, they do say that there is no individual fantasy. And this is, of course, it goes, I mean, it's not deeper than that, but it is also important to understand that there is no individual fantasy because there is no individual to begin with, right? And that's one of the points.
I mean, we know that's a capitalist myth.
Exactly, yes, but that is precise, especially in relation to the question of servitude. That's key. I mean, that's really what is presented as a fiction, right? And that ultimately creates the whole paradigm of power, of capture, and of servitude.
I just want to go down real quick, just for clarification. This is why I'm doing this in terms of this whole thing of design machine. This is on the bottom of page 63, about 8 lines up. If we must still speak of utopia in the sense, a la Fourier, it is most assuredly not as an ideal model, but as revolutionary action and passion. In his recent works, Klosowski, who, as those of you who don't know, wrote a brilliant book on Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, was a novelist, Robert Sessois, as well as many other moments, translator of Heidegger. Fred Jameson said the most intelligent person he ever met, for whatever that's worth. But anyway, indicates to us the only means of bypassing the sterile parallelism, and this is Klosowski speaking, where we flounder between Freud and Marx, and that is by discovering how social production and relations of production are an institution of desire, right? And how affects or drives form part of the infrastructure itself. For they are part of it, they are present there in every way while creating within the economic forms their own repression, as well as the means for breaking this repression. Okay, and then Bruno, the development of distinctions between group and individual fantasy, so sufficiently well, at least, that there is no individual fantasy, right? Indeed, there are 2 types of groups, subject groups and subjugated groups. Very interesting too, subject groups and subjugated groups, right? And with Oedipus and castration forming the imaginary structure under which members of the subjugated groups are induced to live or fantasize individually their membership in the group. It must still be said that these 2 types of group are perpetually shifting, a subject group always being threatened with subjugation, and a subjugational group capable, in certain cases, of being forced to take on a revolutionary role. It is therefore all the more disturbing to see to what extent Freudian analysis retains from the fantasy only its lines of exclusive disjunction and flattens it into an individual or pseudo-individual dimensions, which by their very nature refer the fantasy to subjugated groups, rather than carrying not the opposite operation and disengaging in the fantasy the underlying element of a revolutionary group potential. When we hear that learn that the instructor, the teacher, is daddy, and the colonel too, and also the mother, where all the agents of social production and anti-production are in this way reduced to figures of familial reproduction, we can understand why this panicked libido no longer risks abandoning Oedipus and internalizes it. You remind me of your father, you remind me of your mother, et cetera, et cetera. This goes on time and time again, an institutional thing. There must have been something in the family background anytime there seems to be a productive uprising. This happens all the time. It happens, as you know, in subject groups, and it also happens sometimes in subjugated groups. How this conflict starts. Bruno, yes?
Yeah, no, if I may, because this is, of course, really interesting, and I don't want to promote my own work now, but, I mean, what I do in my recent book is to say how precisely both the subject and also the subjugated subject, I mean, whether it's the production of subjectivity or subjugation as such, they all belong in the paradigm of subjection. There is always some kind of subjection. So in this shifting, even between the subject and
subject group. They're speaking about
subject group and subjugated group. Right.
Fantasy.
Right. But whether it's a subject group or subjugated, right? There is always this, am I right, possibility of understanding all this in terms of a logic of subjection, whereby, right, the point is with the schizoid is the line of flight that they also speak of is to exit, right, the whole modality of subjection and therefore subjectivity.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, Deleuze uses the example of George Jackson, right? For all of us that know George Jackson, the Soledad brother, he says he takes a line of flight, but he picks up a weapon along the way, right? This to me is, there's no subjection anymore. He's part of a subjugated group and he wants out, even though, and as Anthony Wilden very nicely put, many years ago, to the Senegalese revolutionary guerrilla, the M16 or the AK-47 is not a phallic symbol. It has something very different in terms of its desiring production and what it means about in terms of being a subjugated group fighting. So I think these are things we have to keep in mind. Again, going back to where Lydia spoke about symbol and investment, in Freud and also, of course, the interpretation of dream is filled with dream symbolism, right? I mean, you interpret, right? Again, this is a text experimentally is anti-interpretive. It's anti-hermeneutic. It's anti-analytic interpretive in terms of the classical models. So where we go with this is another story. But again, it's this, as I mentioned earlier, maybe a flow book, right? We're looking at flows at work and we're trying to give some of our own logic to it, we're trying to bring it into the logic of flows, if you want to look at it that way. When logic in the strict sense of that we, bring some order, to the flows, so that we understand better. Yeah. So yeah. Please, yeah.
Bruno and to everybody, about this, again, this individual group, that, Bruno, you said that we all know that there are no individuals and, they say that there's no individual fantasy, but not everyone is convinced of that there are no individuals. And I would be interested in what people...
Most people are convinced the world is still flat, unfortunately. This is our problem today in a lot of ways. We are in feudal society with the new technologies, with the new nominalism, which is, I hope, a book some people in this room will take up, especially, people that have 20, 30 years ahead of them. But anyway, yeah, please, Carl, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, well, sort of my... kind of, a simple way of putting it is that there are, inside individuals, we have unconscious structures, or what the French sociologist Bourdieu talks about, the habitus, which is the way the social order is actually instilled in the body.
Right.
Very interesting concept. So there's a way we could talk about the individual as not sort of this bourgeois, sovereign, autonomous subject, but as infused by social relations. But I think that there's Bruno, this is kind of a question, like, how do you understand when you say there are no individuals? I mean, empirically, there are individuals, right? And I think that we would not want to deny that, or we would not want to deny that an individual has some range of agency or choice. If individuals have no agency and no choice, this book would have no reason to exist, because in some sense it supposes people will read it and be able to act on it, ultimately collectively. But so I'm just kind of...
But no, Carl, there are 2 points that I would like to make. One is that although what seems to be the individual that I am, you are, and so on and so forth, is always already, one might say, made of so many different fragments, so many different machinic assemblages and assemblages of assemblages, right? And then that no one is really independent there is always dependency, and there is at best there is interdependence, right? So whereby no one would be what one is without the others. And this is, I mean, there is a long tradition, not only, right? If we look at Simondon, that was very important for Deleuze, certainly, and Guattari. But I mean, I always like to say in African philosophy, the concept of Ubuntu, sorry, you be you and you, means I am because we are. A person is because of and through the other people. Right. So, and this is not an abstract thing. It's very concrete. It's very real. So what I am is then a composition of all these parts, which is also at the same time a constant decomposition and recomposition. And then I am always, right, intimately related to everyone. I mean, certainly those who are closer to me and so on, but so I don't know if that addresses the question.
The trans-individuation, it applies here, but I would add more what, as Michael says, the flow, becoming. So there's that nomadic subjectivity of becoming while you are in trans-individuation. Deleuze would emphasize the movement, the flow, the becoming, instead of being in time and being in nothingness, it's becoming. And
what is trans-individuation?
Well, that, you know, this is the vocabulary that, you know, starts, you know, that's not really, I think, that operative in this book, but it's a vocabulary that comes out of Gilbert Simondon, and then it's taken up somewhat by Bernard Stiegler later. And it's another offshoot of French philosophy that never really had a reception here in the United States until recently in a few places. So, or really that much in Europe. You want to go ahead?
If I may add, Michael, because certainly
individuation in the beginning, that's a presupposition of what it means to live in some way, right?
Difference. So in difference and repetition, Deleuze goes into Simondon. I mean, Simondon is not treated at all here. However, when they speak about the transversal and the trans this and trans that and the transsexual, right? I mean, a very interesting moment when they speak about the question of sexuality, they deny there too the either or, right? And they say it's a matter of being transsexual.
Right.
So the trans is, and they use this prefix in so many instances, which I think that's a way of addressing, maybe in a more implicit way, trans-individuality per se. So, and I don't know, again, I mean, that's my take, that there is always there, the coming together of things, and they also becoming that, Chris, I agree completely with that, of course. I mean, and you say it's also part of this trans individual thing, right? I mean, that
nomadic subjectivity.
Right. Yes, yes, I agree.
I mean, Chris keeps on walking after she falls, right?
Right.
She still has that.
I morph. I'm a butterfly.
That's right, exactly.
So, but then, Carl, I don't know if this in any way we can talk more than Carl. But
I mean, this language again. I mean, I think, you know, one thing we certainly and you know, I mean, Bruno and I have both read, you know, in this domain very actively about the trans individual and, you know, trans individuation, and Bruno has a concept of dividuation too. And, you know, a person that's only mentioned one or two times here is Lang, you know, the divided self, you know, which is really about dividuation. It's about the dividuation that somehow the Spaltung that David was referring to earlier, the splitting of the subject, the splitting of the ego, you know, this kind of you know, moment of Freud in the later parts of his clinical work and reflections, this is operative in all of us in many ways, right? The divided self, right? This is what we're thrown into in a strange way, right? We live with I mean, I certainly, we have Marxist heads and capital bodies. It's the new dualism in a certain way. We live in a system we despise. We're anti the system. At the same time, we've been unable to think about as subjugated groups how to get out of it. We pose alternatives every time it comes up. So this is, again, another thing. I mean, capitalism at this point, if we really look at this is completely anti-life. But, the best we get out there is because, I'm not putting this down, but the biggest issue, of course, is the Black Lives Matter, right? In a sense, this is what happens. Instead of the movement for life itself, right? We're really in this position. I agree with Marcuse. The fight for Eros, or the fight for the life drive, or the fight for, in a way, transsexuality as a translibidinality is really where we are. But we, unfortunately, it gets reduced to single issue groups in a sense, right? And we have this kind of movement again today of the subject group and the subjugated groups, right? In a sense, this is going on all the time. And industry is built on this, cottage industry, cults of experts. I think this is very profound in a way to be extended into a contemporary analysis, at least to my mind. Yeah.
Can I also say, I mean, I may be completely wrong in this, but after doing the vaccine, right, I did Moderna, like right. You did as well, and Tony. And so I did some very quick research. I want to know more about it. But these are RNA-based vaccines, right? They're completely new.
Important. Yeah. Huh? M is important because that's the messenger.
It's right. Yeah, very important. Right. And it's the ribonucleic acid, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, this is a simplistic rendering of what I understood, which is also very simplistic, but I want to say it to share. It seems to me that it is as if, which is interesting biologically, immunologically, and biopolitically. It is as if our bodies became now fortresses, as if we built a firewall, right? Because apparently the message is sent to the cells, whereby, I mean, the virus may be there, we can still be infected, but the vaccine is not going to give us the antigen like the traditional vaccines, so part of the virus itself. But it is a way of detecting and protecting the body from attack. Now, this is really, I don't know, again, it may be completely wrong.
No, I think you're right on that. And I think this fits very much with the later work of Guattari in terms of molecular biology and in this. And this is a language that, let me finish, Chris, and then, this is a language that fits into the new biologics, in which you say also biopolitics, which again, to a lot of the left has not been taken that seriously, right? Biopolitics is considered a reactionary, moment of Foucault's neoliberalism, all these kind of very, very reductionistic spikes. Yes, please, Chris, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just thinking of, oh no, I lost my thought. I was thinking of how Heraclitus teaches us becoming and transforming and changing. And you took my thought.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that.
Michael, I have a question or two.
I just want to mention what Bruno speaks to. We could say from the Chinese flu to the Great Wall of China.
I know what I was saying.
Back to our dear old, this is what we're building. This fortress. It's not empty. It's a it's a new hermeneutic.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it can go into the two directions. One is protection of the old individual of not the neoliberal tradition. The other is instead that of going toward the reproduction of new machines of production of desire, right? I mean, so that's
Absolutely. Yeah,
the
please.
question. You know.
Yeah. No,
Absolutely.
good. We'll go back to that.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this, what may be a paradigm shift in terms of vaccination, right? Depasteurization is operative now, right?
We first think of subject. We think of subject as in terms of being ruled over by a monarch or a ruler, and that makes us subject. And I think that's where we get subjective. Maybe we need to leave the subjectivities and move toward a Deleuze and Guattari transformation.
Okay, yeah,
Well,
we'll hold that. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one aspect to certainly consider. Yeah, Carl, yeah, please.
So this is
Yeah.
to go back to, this is all kind of interrelated, but this idea of group fantasy and individual fantasy and the
Right.
operations of psychoanalysis in this kind of configuration. And I didn't fully understand the reference to the Laborde Clinic and the work they were doing, right? What they meant by group fantasy. I mean, they say here on page 62, group fantasy was inseparable from the symbolic articulations that define a social field, as far as it is real. And then again, later they talk, at the bottom of that page, what we already talked about, that, through group fantasy, it potentially has this revolutionary moment where institutions become mutable, not these kind of reified, transcendent things, but that they can be actively transformed. But does anyone know more about what they're referencing here in terms of group fantasy? I wasn't totally clear, other than what I could cull from the text, is that it seems, and it's interesting to go back to where we, the points you were raising earlier, Michael, is that, why do we desire fascism? It seems that the group fantasy could take very different forms. It's not revolutionary or progressive. In fact, unfortunately, it's
no, it's a very good point. I mean, they're not excluding. Desire is not only revolutionary, even though that's what they want to get to through this very, very, if you will, critical machine that is smashing everything in its way to get to revolution. Desire is revolutionary in its essence. This is part of the goal, where they really want to go in, that's where the schizoid is, right, in a sense. Yeah. Going back to Laborde Clinic, I can probably find, I'll do my best to find some of the stuff that Guattari did. I will make I'll make a thing of, I think I mentioned Lucio Pazzi, an artist who lives in Soho, who actually visited Laborde and wrote on some of the fantasies there, especially with the art brut movement. That I did in a homage to Guattari years ago, about 20 years ago. But anyway, so they had many things. But I will mention a play in which this notion of group fantasy and psychic exchange is playing out. Is Jean Genet in The Balcony. The Balcon. It's a very interesting play. If you go back and look at that, as well as the screens and the blacks. So in some ways, Genet, and he got into a battle with Maurice Merleau-Ponty, over Genet made the comment, what does Merleau-Ponty know about black? So anyway, except as a color and perception. But anyway, it's a very nasty exchange. But Genet, in a way, plays out the group fantasy in The Balcony. And there's a great rendition of this that's online from the American Film Theater done in the 70s, which Peter Falk plays the chief of police, and Shelley Winters is the madam. It's a very, very good, and what was the name of the actress? Another very good actress played the bookkeeper at the brothel. So very interestingly enough, Genet understood that the panopticon somehow became the brothel, right, in a sense. And he stages this during the French Revolution, the fantasies of everyone replaying the French Revolution. So this is interesting. They had many, many attempts to take historical sequences and fantasize with the patients there, at Laborde. So this was a part of, as Richard was saying, a patient population that was worked with, right, in terms of group fantasy. This wasn't just a bunch of theorists sitting around or clinicians. They were actually inducing, if you will, or, maybe encouraging or whatever, or just sitting back and watching this at work, in a sense. So this is interesting in that regard.
Artaud's theater of cruelty.
Yes, and Artaud's theory of cruelty is another thing they referred to, but I don't know if they were taking psilocybin and other forms of, mind-altering drugs at the clinic. They may have been, who knows? I mean, of course.
How would you know?
I don't know. I wasn't there. Yeah, I didn't have that pleasure or delirium at that period. Yeah, anyway. So, yeah. So yes, David, please. Yeah.
Michael, I was just curious. In the way Deleuze and Guattari evolved, did they see this as their masterwork, the pinnacle of their thinking?
No, I think the masterwork were two other. I mean, Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus, which I think I've left in the other room. But anyway, a very big tome, which is really worth looking at because you get an idea, to use your term, how they evolved from this. 8 years later. So 8 years later, they published 1,000 Plateaus that I think was translated in the United States 87, 7 years later. Anti-Oedipus 72 in France, and I think 77 in the States. So so that to me is an attempt to put schizoid analysis to work, right, in a way. And then Guattari wrote many essays on schizoid analysis, and Deleuze produced a series of essays called Regimes of Madness, in which he looked at, as Derrida, as Alan Bass would well know, the regimes of madness, was looking at how mad, became codified, right, et cetera, and then decodified. And he looks at how regimes and how people, thought within this, going back to subjection, right, in a sense, right? Yeah. So, I mean, the beauty of Michel Foucault in some ways to me was that, despite everything else, of his brilliance and mental clinic, he really understood regimes and epistemic structures, right? How knowledge, was really created through regimes. And Derrida understood how theory itself was part of a legitimating function. It had this juridical legitimating function. So between these two, the regimes, the registers, if you will, of the writing, and they use language of recording here, right? The recording machine, it's very dated in that way. I mean, if they wrote this about Silicon Valley, but to be honest with you, you think about desiring machines. You take a look at these young kids in technology. I'm sorry if you have a son that's making $5 million a year in Silicon Valley. But anyway, all to say, you can see that this was part of that machinaic moment, right, in the development of the human being. It's kind of a new ontology, a new subjectivity. Or I won't use that word, a new transindividuation. Gates, Zuckerberg. You can look at it down the ways. How do these creatures? How are they formed? What happens in this regard? Right, in many ways, and what's been happening the last 40 years, in this moment. So as I think I mentioned, when I remember 1980, 81, a psychoanalyst in Baltimore telling me all that's coming up are jingos from TV programs from the unconscious. So I can imagine what's coming up today.
Yeah, and maybe in the service of ressentiment, with the rise of the billionaire class, it's kind of creating a more negative culture of ressentiment gone wayward, because the people in it, as hard as they might work, or they might make 2.5 million, have a dwarfed fallows, so to speak, compared to people.
That's a good point.
Thing where they're never going to get to it. Whereas I think America in the 30s and 40s had a somewhat realizable illusions of sorts that said, but if you work hard, you can become a millionaire. You might just play it right. Whereas this feels like it's so impossible. You're lost as the middle children of history in the middle class, which is shrinking. You're never going to get there. You just can't. It's like the game is stacked against you. And I think even the bright ones, the ones who might come up with some little mini version of Snapchat, get it. They're just not going to become that fabulous, Mick Jagger rock star, so to speak, of capitalism. It's out of reach.
Right. Right. No, and I hear you there. And also in terms of what's being created by new capital flows too. There's nothing that's coming back around. You know, Bill Gates is now the largest holder of agricultural land in the United States.
Well,
I mean, just to give you an idea, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you can start putting pieces together. But at another level, I don't think we should go there. But anyway, it's you know, it's kind of remarkable what's coming down. You know, in many ways. And yeah,
So with the production of these new subjectivities you were
yeah,
referring
yeah.
to, this is I would be very interested in the clinicians here, what they think, the people who have done clinical practice. Does it render the Oedipal complex irrelevant? I mean, at one point it seemed like Oedipus was a way to understand a certain kind of way we interject certain authority structures through the family.
Right.
Is this still central and operative in the psyches of people today, or is it? And if not, what has it been replaced by?
what a great question. And I think in this way, where more like modern clinical psychoanalysis goes is with a plurality of thought as a more case by case basis. So you might see someone where it's so clear there's some kind of repetitive theme of competition and wanting to kill their father or mother and seduce the other one. I think it's opened up where it's no longer in such a heterosexist model of boys want to kill the father and sleep with their mother. I think that's kind of mixed up. But I would say there's also an interesting movement away from the ego psychologists to more the power of pre-Oedipal formation and deformations, largely spirited by a student of Heidegger's, Hans Lowald.
Yeah.
And I think in Lowell, the key thing he had was really rejecting this whole idea that ego psychology people had of saying you submit to the external reality largely because you've resolved your Oedipal complex and realize you can never sleep with your mother and you have to renounce these impulses to murder your father and you have to just move to the suburbs and have two kids. Lowell's idea was to say there's much more of a metaphysical dance between the child's inner fantasy world being celebrated and not renounced. But how, if the child's fantasy is encouraged, let's say it looks at the clouds and sees a cloud as a Saint Bernard, that there's a kind of duality of it is a cloud and a Saint Bernard at the same time because the fantasy is very important. The idea would be under a healthy circumstance where the fantasy is encouraged, you wouldn't have someone who becomes psychotic and says, all I can think of are clouds or St. Bernards, but more how do I use the sense of agency within my system individually in the family system and that hopefully supports it and the larger world around it, where I could become more of a J.K. Rowling or a Picasso or someone who's able to use the fantasy to say, I could actually actualize that and make the world a different place by assembling all sorts of different impulses and ideas I have and not feeling they just have to remain in my head, but can move into the world in a dialogue that shapes it and sees conflict as an invitation to move pieces around in an ever-shifting matrix of interesting challenges to create more, to give more, to reassemble the world and actually impact the external world without saying, no, you submit, but of saying, no, you create, you change, you challenge.
Yeah, very,
You
very,
know,
yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Hans Laval, a very good student of Heidegger's and
right.
very, very interesting in terms of taking the best of design analysis and bringing it to psychoanalysis analysis and, you know, psychotherapy today. Very, very, very crucial. Yeah. Yeah, in that way. Yeah. I mean, so Bill Gates is in the backyard in the shed and tinkering with a machine. And just think what you can do, Bill, you know, et cetera. I mean, we have to think about how are these people formed in a way, you know, Deleuze and Guattari talk about, they always return to Linder, the boy with the machine, right? With his German expressionist painter. Again, the book is at one level a very long meditation on Linder's, the front piece of the book, you know, boy with machine. And what does that mean? And I want to just go back again, and maybe Jane or Lydia or anybody else, Patrick, want to respond to this in a way that, obviously know Freud and clinical practice. Any thoughts about the very good question that Carl asked? Yeah. Yeah. No?
Well, toxic masculinity is a thing, and I can't see a revolution in which fathers aren't targeted for execution. So
I see. Okay. Okay. So superheroes will continue, huh? Okay. Yeah. Thor from the north, huh? Yeah. Right. Yeah. David, yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, I was just nodding.
Oh, you were just nodding. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I won't. We don't have to belay. Chris, you wanted to say something, or you're?
No, I'm in between thoughts.
Okay, good. Okay, well, that's probably a very good place to be with Felix and Gilles. Yeah,
I would say this, which is, I think one of the things that's changed, to go to Carl's question, for clinicians is the idea of trying to avoid, as much as is possible, participant observation bias of saying everything is Oedipal or everything is castration, but to stay more open, which isn't easy, to saying, what's coming in from the patient amidst a plethora of Freudian, Kleinian, Winnicottian, Cohoutian, Derridian lines of thought. I mean, it's hard to kind of pull all of that together and to see, which I think Freud flirted with but didn't quite get, but post-Freudians did, how much are you clinically able to be open to the idea that you yourself will be changed by the patient because you don't reduce it down with your own defenses to saying, I don't know what the hell's going on here, so it's easier to see it as an Oedipal conflict or pre-Oedipal conflict, but to say this might break new ground and be something very different that I hopefully can help the person with, but I'm willing to stand in this very difficult space of the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Almost in a Kierkegaardian way to say, I'm kind of the knight of resignation. There may not be something knowable about this, but I'm listening and trying to formulate it as best I can, where I think 20 to 30 years ago, people were more divided in camps professionally that said, I have a specific identity, and to fit into my institute structure, I've got to kind of toe the line. At group presentations with colleagues, if I were to introduce some idea from Kohut at the New York Psychoanalytic, I might be in professional trouble.
You get slaughtered by the Lacanians.
Right. You would have a little bit more.
Non grata. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. You could find yourself being
psychology
questioned a lot.
Very much of a regress on, the Lacanians. Yes.
Right. But in a funny anecdote, one of the women, she's not here tonight, a very nice colleague of mine, Jane Algus, we were roughly at the same.
She's below you. She's here.
Is she? Jane, hi. But we were at roughly the same point in her analytic training. Jane in the New York Psychoanalytic, which is a little more conservative, and I was at a place called IPTAR, which was a little bit more like a left-wing, everything goes place, studying the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality at pretty much exactly the same moment. So we called each other, and Jane said, I am so disturbed by the reading of this book where it just seems so homophobic and so derivative of saying, sexuality has to go a certain way from a very good teacher. Whereas I was having this experience with someone at IPTAR who was like, it's such a radical text because it's really saying sexuality can be everything. Perversion is kind of a meaningless concept because sexuality by nature is perverse because it's all about being, in a sense, a desiring machine where what you want to take in and incorporate and move with and either enter, penetrate, be penetrated by, or take in. It's all fair game. There's no pathologizing any of it if it's in the service of pleasure. So it shows you just how much the environment that people trained to become clinicians in can be very shaping of a point of view on a particular text, which is potentially very, very different.
Right. Very, very interesting, because you bring up this a very good question that Marcuse was very good on the polymorphous, perverse nature of us, and and this is a sort of one of the main backbones of Eros and civilization. Again, that the political fight, somehow he puts that into the political fight, is for Eros itself, right? And Eros and perversion. And, you know, a lot of the people that were, you know, ostracized from the French psychoanalytic sessions, Janine, I think her name is Schmergel.
Right.
That's a great circle. Well, a great book on creativity and perversion. For creativity, one must be aware of one's, you know, perversion or understand it. And, you know, of course, the play in the Lacanian circles is it's the version of the father, the père version, right? The story of the father is sort of the play on the terms that goes back to the names of the father, which again is under attack in this book, is the names of the father in the symbolic order. And we'll get to that. I mean, I don't want to go so far, you know, ahead here, but yeah.
Sorry, Michael, who would understand perversion that way?
Creativity and perversion. I have the book, Bruno.
Yeah.
I'll loan it to you if you want. Yeah.
No, but perversion is going back to for the father, you said?
Oh, there was a joke about père, you know.
A joke, okay.
A joke about.
Okay, so I missed that.
I'm with Freud on that.
No, because otherwise, in fact, I like what David just said, but also because, I mean, the prefix, per is all, right? And version is verse is to lean, right? I mean, to lean in all directions, which is actually a wonderful concept that goes back to the logical multiplicity that we are reading about, and that's
and hence Marcuse's phrase, polymorphous perversity.
Yeah.
The multiple forms.
Right. Yeah.
Very, very, very interesting in that way. Yeah, so maybe we should go, I mean, quickly to, I know it's getting late, but maybe we should go to this section on the three texts of Freud, again, where we sort of began tonight. And maybe to what you were speaking to too, Bruno, the transcendental philosophy. So maybe we should read, you know, just to get us back on the theoretical plane for a minute. You know, not that we ever got off of it, but you know, to return, if you will, to some of the things they're talking about. This in relation to Freud and to Oedipalization. So the connective synthesis of production is the section 3, pages 68 to 75, which again, I think is crucial in this section. In reality, and this is page 74, the problem has nothing to do with pre-Oedipal stages and would still revolve around an Oedipal axis. And they've already gone through Klein on this, right? If you remember earlier in the text. But rather with the existence and the nature of an Oedipal.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but maybe, and I don't know, maybe because I was away for a moment, but I don't know if you went over really the end at the bottom of page 69 and the top of 70. That's very important, an important introduction to what you're reading now as well. I mean, if you don't mind, I think it's really.
Okay, you have that Kant in mind tonight, I see. Okay.
No, I mean.
No, I understand. It's very important. So we can go back to page 71. The general parental or familial use of the synthesis of recording extends into a conjugal use or an alliance use of the connective synthesis of production. A regime for the pairing of people replaces the connection of partial objects. On the whole, the connections of organ machines suited to desiring production give way to a pairing of people under the rules of familial reproduction. Partial objects now seem to be taken from people rather than from the non-personal flows that pass from one person to another. The reason is that persons are derived from abstract quantities instead of from flows. Again, to you know, talk about that. And this, of course, is very anti-Hegelian too, you know, in terms of that kind of dialectical thinking. Instead of a connective appropriation, partial objects become the possessions of a person, and when required, the property of another person. Just as he draws upon centuries of scholastic reflections in defining God as the principle of the disjunctive syllogism, Kant draws upon centuries of Roman juridical reflection when he defines marriage as the tie that makes a person the owner of the sexual organs of another person, and to put it in more explicit terms, the ownership of the other's genitals was really what he said directly. And Kant had one relationship in his sexual encounter in his life, according to scholarship. So anyway, but yeah, so the celibate machine itself. One need only consult a religious manual of sexual casuistry to see what restrictions the organ design machine connections remain tolerated within the regime for the pairing of people, which legally determines which may be appropriated from the body of the earth. Okay, so where do you want to go with this, Bruno? Because I was going to go to the notion of the...
No, but yeah, I'm not sure where you are at page, which page are you reading?
At 69, the bottom of 69.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about the last line in contrast to the alternative of the either or exclusions. There is, and then over to page 70, the either or over the combinations and permutations where the difference is, you don't mind if I read these few lines?
No, I don't mind. I guess I have a different edition because...
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But for the others, can I read these few lines?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay, so where the differences amount to the same without ceasing to be differences. And then we are statistically or morally heterosexual, but personally homosexual without knowing it or being fully aware of it. And finally, we are transsexual in an elemental molecular sense. And this goes over right into page 74, you know.
Right, okay.
There is a clear connection, yeah.
Okay. I just was going to go back because
Yes,
he speaks about this notion of, again, the name of transcendental philosophy as a criteria. This is the important part. So this is page 74, before the last paragraph before we get to the disjunctive synthesis of recording. In reality, the problem has nothing to do with pre-Oedipal stages that would still revolve around an Oedipal axis, but rather with the existence and nature of an An-Oedipal sexuality, an An-Oedipal heterosexuality, and homosexuality, an An-Oedipal castration. The break-flows of desiring production do not let themselves be projected onto a mythical locale. The signs of desire do not let themselves be extrapolated from a signifier. Transsexuality does not let any qualitative opposition between a local and non-specific heterosexuality and a local and non-specific homosexuality arise. Everywhere in this reversion, the innocence of flowers instead of the guilt of conversion. And, of course, Genet's great Our Lady of the Flowers is kind of the anchoring point there. But rather than ensuring or tending to ensure the reversion of the entire unconscious according to the An-Oedipal form and within the An-Oedipal content of desiring production, analytical theory and practice never cease to promote the conversion of the unconscious to Oedipus. This is very repetitious, but they keep going back there. And remember, there's something going on in France as we began earlier today and in the United States. Form and content. We shall see in effect what psychoanalysis calls resolving Oedipus. And this will be later, next week, right? Thus, conversion is therefore promoted by psychoanalysis, first of all, by making a global and specific use of the connective synthesis. This use can be defined as transcendent, and it implies a first paralogism in the psychoanalytic process. For a simple reason, we again make use of Kantian terminology. In what he termed the critical revolution, or the Copernican revolution in philosophy, critical philosophy, Kant intended to discover criteria immanent to understanding, so as to distinguish the legitimate and the illegitimate uses of the synthesis of consciousness. In the name of transcendental philosophy, immanence of criteria, Kant therefore denounced the transcendent use of syntheses such as appeared in metaphysics. In like fashion, we are compelled to say that psychoanalysis has its metaphysics, and that metaphysics' name is Oedipus. And that a revolution, this time materialist, and this is very important for my purposes certainly, can proceed only by way of a critique of Oedipus, by denouncing the illegitimate use of the synthesis of the unconscious as found in the Oedipal psychoanalysis, so as to rediscover a transcendental unconscious defined by the immanence of its criteria and a corresponding practice that we shall call schizoid analysis. So this becomes part of the element, if you will, very crucial passage moving forward as a set of principles to be worked through to the end of this book, right? In many ways, or the end of this text, if you will, because when we get to the, the 8th, 9th, 10th weeks, maybe 11th or 12th, or where we're going, introduction to schizoid analysis. I'm like David. I'm infinite in terms of in confronting the text. It's not a finite 10 weeks. We'll go to the infinite 12 or something like that. But anyway, very, very interesting here. This is beginning of the elements and the criteria in which the bulldozing operation, if you will, the smashing, the critical dialectic will be enacted in terms of getting to the task for materialist psychiatry, which they call in the beginning. Their task is to set up a materialist psychology. They still think Oedipus, and even Freud himself, filled with, as Lydia pointed out, there are ideologies still being produced all over the place in psychoanalysis, and they're trying to get away from this, right? In a way. So, yeah. And again, they don't mention him in every paragraph, but Reich is also operative here all the time, that Wilhelm Reich, thinking, if you've read any Reich, of course, The Mass Psychology of Fascism is a great book, but, the book on character analysis, Listen Man, of course, his writings on the organ, and I guess some of you know that he had conversations. Einstein didn't take it ultimately that seriously, but he did talk to Einstein about his findings in the early 1940s. So anyway, so this is very important because this in a way, this number 3 of tonight's reading, the section 3 is very important because they're starting to set up the criteria here for this schizoid analysis. And the next section, I want to read this too because I'd like us to be as close as we can to being on their page as well. And I mean, this is an extraordinarily intelligent, well-informed group. So again, we may have to put aside a little bit of our knowledge just to really follow along at times, because we have a tendency to bring in our own backgrounds and project it onto the text. So anyway, this is crucial. Page 76. The schizophrenic is not man and woman. He is man or woman, right? But he belongs primarily to both sides, man on the side of man, woman, and on the side of woman, on the side of woman. Likable, Jaillet, Albert Désir, matriculation, this is fun, intones the litany of the parallel series of the masculine and feminine and places himself on both sides. Matt Albert, 54, the thing, he goes through these codes that are going on. The schizophrenic is dead or alive, not both at once, but each of the two as the terminal point of a distance over which he glides. He is child or parent, not both, but the one at the end of the other, like the two ends of a stick in a non-decomposable space. This is the meaning of the disjunction, and this is interesting, where Beckett records his characters and the events that befall them. Everything divides, but into itself. And again, this is very important. Those of you that know Endgame, Ham and Clove, right? Those of you that know, the movement of Pazzo and Lucky and Waiting for Godot, right? Those of you that know the Malone series, etc. So it would be a brutal, right? Even everything divides, but even the distance are positive at the same time as the included disjunction. It would be a total misunderstanding of this order of thought if we concluded that the schizophrenic substituted vague synthesis of identification of contradictory elements for disjunctions like the last of the Hegelian philosophers. He does not substitute syntheses of contradictory elements for disjunctive synthesis. Rather, for the exclusive and the restricted use of the disjunctive synthesis, he substitutes an affirmative use. And this again is Deleuze and Guattari's principle always. Affirmation is at the base of everything. Yeah, at the base. Yeah, it's the affirmation. And they're very Spinozaist in this way. Very, very, very much to keep that in mind too. And we'll go back there. I know we're running out of time today. He by means of elaboration instead infirms it through a continuous overflight. And this is again a transflight, if you want to use that kind of language, an overflight spanning an indivisible distance. An indivisible distance. He is not simply bisexual or between the two or intersexual. He is transsexual. He is trans, alive, dead, transparent child. He does not reduce two contraries to an identity of the same. He affirms their distance as that which relates the two as different. He does not confine himself inside contradictions. On the contrary, he opens out and, like a spore case inflated with spores, releases them as so many singularities that he improperly shut off, some of which he intended to exclude while retaining others, but which now become point signs, all affirmed by the new distance, by their new distance. The disjunction, being now inclusive, does not closet itself in its own, inside its own terms. On the contrary, it is non-descriptive. And then he quotes Beckett here. I was then no longer this closed box to which I owed being so well preserved, but a partition came crashing down, an event that will liberate a space where Malloy and Moran no longer designate persons, but singularities flocking from all sides, evanescent agents of production. This is free disjunction. So Beckett is a great example, a literary example, if you will, illustrative of this, disjunctive synthesis, particularly free disjunction. The differential positions persist in their entirety. They even take on a free quality, but they are all inhabited by a faceless and transpositional subject. Judge Schraber is man and woman, parent and child, which is to say he is situated wherever there is a singularity. In all the series and in all the branches marked by a singular point, because he is himself this distance that transforms him into a woman, and at its terminal point, he is already the mother of a new humanity and can finally die. Okay, so this is interesting. The reading of Beckett and Judge Schraber together in terms of this free disjunction. Very interesting strategy. So that is why the schizophrenic God has little to do with the God of religion. Interesting, right? This really becomes interesting, even though they are related to the same syllogism. In Baphomet, Kwiatkowski contrasts God as the master of the exclusions and restrictions that derive from the disjunctive syllogism, with an antichrist who is the prince of modification, determining instead the passage of a subject through all possible predicates. Right? I am God, I am not God. I am God, I am man. It is not a matter of a synthesis that would go beyond the negative disjunction of the derived reality in an original reality of man-God, but rather of an inclusive disjunction that carries out the synthesis itself in drifting, emphasis drifting from one term to another and following the distance between terms. Nothing is primal or primordial, I would add, or origin, right? In this sense. It is like the famous conclusion to Beckett's Malloy. It is midnight. The rain is beating on the windows. It was not midnight. It was not raining. Nijinsky wrote, I am God. I was not God. I am a clown of God. I am Apis. I am an Egyptian. I am a Red Indian. I am a Negro. I am a Chinaman. I am a Japanese. I am a foreigner, a stranger. I am a seabird, a land bird. I am on the tree of Tolstoy. I am the roots of Tolstoy. I am husband and wife in one. I love my wife. I love my husband. What counts is not parental designations nor racial or divine designations, but merely the use, and again, important here, the use made of him. No problem of meaning, right? But only of image. Nothing original or derived, but a generalized drift. It would seem that the schizoid liberates a raw genealogical material, non-restrictive, where he can situate himself, record himself, and take his bearings in all the branches at once on all sides. He explodes the Oedipal genealogy, right? Through a graduated relationship. Sorry to read so much, but this is very, again, crucial, I think, based on the materialist psychiatry on the schizoid, where they're really going here. And this is a very good description. The genealogical madness lays out a disjunctive network on the body without organs, and God, who designates none other than the energy of recording, right? One can be the greatest enemy in the paranoid inscription, but also the greatest friend in the miraculating inscription. In any case, the question of a being superior to man and to nature does not arise here at all. Everything is on the body without organs, both what is inscribed and the energy that inscribes it. On the unengendered body, the non-decomposable distances are necessarily surveyed, why the disjointed terms are all inferred. I am the letter, the pen, and the paper. It was in this fashion that Nijinsky kept his diary. Yes, I was my father and I was my son. I just want to add here, I'm a big fan of Cecil Taylor. I don't know if you guys know jazz, but Cecil Taylor passed away about a year ago. Cecil Taylor was the piano. There was no Cecil Taylor. He lived about 3 blocks from me, etc. But he was the piano. If you have a chance, you should look at his later work. I had the pleasure of hearing him 4 times live and, watch him run around the neighborhood as well. But anyway, he became the piano. He was a desiring machine, the piano, right? I am the piano. I am the piano that plays 88 tiny drums, I am not Cecil Taylor, a subject that does so. So this is very interesting, the way it works. They work with Nijinsky, so in a way, I hope this is kind of, coming together in a way that becomes interesting to us, that you're seeing this beginning of the descriptions, if you will, and the criteria for this schizoid analysis, how this is very different than, quote, the neurotic on the couch and the language that is used. And Bruno's right, the Kantian language, to go back to this, Deleuze is really imposing, if you will, or brings to the table or to the, whatever they're having, this, tete. He brings this Kantian language of the transcendental criteria, and you can see it playing out here with the disjunctive and the conjunctive here. Yeah. They're, again, trying to go beyond the Kantian notion, I am, as the representations of my thinking, I am, which accompanies, accompany being a key word, all my representation. I am a thinking thing that accompanies all my representations. They're trying to go beyond that, of course, right? But the accompaniment is very important in terms of this disjunction and this disjunctive syllogism. So maybe we should do more on that, because this is going to be important for them vis-a-vis the artists. They're not especially studying, straight up narratives. This is not a study of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and the detective fiction, or even for that matter, Chester Himes, even though, If He Hollers is a great, maybe an example of a lot of disjunctions and double binds, if you know Chester Himes's work. But anyway, this is more on the level Samuel Beckett, Artaud, Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano, where they'll go in terms of the writing machine, to use a Derridian category too. So Then on the next page, and I really think this section is crucial for an understanding of the theory that there and the criteria, and I think that, and maybe we can pick up with this next week too. Double bind, this is on page 79, is the term used by Bateson to describe a simultaneous transmission of two types of messages, one of which contradicts the other. Right? As, for example, the father who says to his son, "Go ahead, criticize me," but strongly hints that all effective criticism, at least a certain type of criticism, will be very unwelcome. Bateson sees in this phenomena a particularly schizophrenizing situation, which he interprets as a contrary from the viewpoint of Russell's theories of types. And by the way, I know I've mentioned this book. I really recommend, if you're interested in this stuff, to reread sections of Tony Wilden's book, Structure, System and Structure, Essays on Communication and Exchange, written in 1972-73, especially the chapter on logical types and ideology. He uses Russell's theory as well as Bateson. It's a very interesting take on what they're doing here. Same year, actually, that this book is published. And Wilden, as you know, was the first translator of Jacques Lacan. Yeah, you know, the language of the self, and then became psychoanalysis and speech, I think it was, or speech and language and psychoanalysis. Anyway, it seems to us that the double bind, the double impasse, is instead a common situation, Oedipalizing par excellence. And although it would require formalization, the other type of nonsense spoken of by Russell is brought to mind by the double bind situation. An alternative and exclusive distinction is defined in terms of a principle which, however, constitutes its two terms or underlying wholes, and where the principle itself enters into the alternative. A completely different case from what happens when the disjunction is inclusive. Very important here. Here we have the second paralogism of psychoanalysis. In short, and you know, the double bind is none other than the whole of Oedipus. It is in this sense that Oedipus should be presented as a series, and this is Deleuze speaking, you know, obviously, logique des sens. He has a very long section on series in there, and the logic of the series, or an oscillation between two poles, the neurotic identification and the internalization that is said to be normative. On one side is Oedipus, the normative, the double impasse. And if the schizoid is produced here as an entity, this occurs for the simple reason that there's no other means of escaping this double path, right? And going back to what Bruno was speaking of, both the either or, right, is operative here, yeah, in this double bind. And the double bind is, you know, the either or can be resolved, at least according to what, you know, Deleuze and Guattari are talking about, in the whole of Oedipus, right? And, you know, the both sides, where normality is no less blocked than neurosis, and where the solution offers no way out than does the problem. Hence the schizoid's withdrawal to the body with organs. That's what happens. This is how the schizoid is produced in this double bind of Oedipus as a whole. It seems like, and I'll end with this, it seems, because this goes into the Jewish question of Marx, by the way, again, on some very interesting paradoxes in the history of philosophy, and certainly in phenomenological work. It seems that Freud himself was acutely aware of Oedipus's inseparability from a double impasse into which he sees he was precipitating the unconscious. Thus, in the 1936 letter to Romain Rolland, by the way, Romain Rolland, for those of you like Antonio Gramsci, was the one who said, "I live by the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will." It was Rolland who coined that phrase. Gramsci took it up from Romain Rolland. And Freud was very aware. Freud, you know, writes, everything unfolds as if the essential were to go beyond the father. No, excuse me, I have bad light. No, if going beyond the father were always forbidden, as if going beyond the father were always forbidden. This becomes even more clear when Freud elaborates the entire historico-mythical series. At the one end, Oedipus bond is established, the Oedipal bond is established by the murderous identification. At the other end, it is reinforced by the restoration and the internalization of the parental authority. Holderling's no, the name, the no of the father's no. Very beautiful piece, by the way, if you're interested in this in a deeper way, by Michel Foucault. He wrote a piece called Holderling's No, the great German poet. So anyway, so parental authority, revival of the old state of things at a new level. Between the two is latency, the celebrated latency, which is without doubt the greatest psychoanalytic mystification. This society of brothers, and again, this is a reading from the founding myth, that's recounted in Totem and Taboo. The society of brothers who forgive themselves the fruits of the crime and spend all the time necessary for internalizing. But we are warned, the society of brothers is very dejected, unstable, and dangerous. It must prepare the way for a rediscovery of an equivalent to parental authority. It must cause us to pass over to the other pole. In accord with the suggestion of Freud's, American society, the industrial society with anonymous management and vanishing personal power, is presented to us as a resurgence of the society without the father. Those of you know probably Alexander Mitralesh's book by that title, a very interesting book, very much taken up by the Frankfurt School. Not surprisingly, the industrial society is burdened with the search for original motives for the restoration of the equivalent. For example, the astonishing discovery by Mitralech that the British royal family, after all, is not so much a bad thing. Right? We can tell Miss Markle that this week, I guess. Anyway, this is very interesting the way they do this. I really like this thing. Thank you, Richard, for your interventions. I see you put in the chat. It is therefore understood that we leave one pole of Oedipus only to pass on to the other. No way of getting out, neurosis or normality. Okay, these are the two poles, right? In a way. The Society of Brothers rediscovers nothing of production and desiring machines. On the contrary, it spreads the veil of latency. As to those who refuse to be Oedipalized in one form or another, and one under the other in the treatment, the psychoanalyst is there to call the asylum or the police for help. Interesting, right? In a sense, right? There's nothing I can do for you. Have you tried Bellevue? I'm being, redundant and but anyway, that's sort of what it's at. Or the police that are called in The Man with a Tape Recorder, which is in the book Between Existentialism and Marxism, the Jean-Jacques Abraham, taking the tape recorder to the psychoanalytic session. So they're reading multiple texts here. Of course, Totem and Taboo and the founding of the primal, brotherhood and the killing of the father, the traditional thing, murder and incest at the bottom, cannibalism, all of these things that Freud speaks to. The police on one side never did psychoanalysis better to display its taste for supporting the movement of social repression and for participating in it with enthusiasm. Let it not be thought that we're alluding to the folkloric aspects of psychoanalysis. In fact, there are some around Lacan, and this is good, and Richard's left us, but anyway, who are developing another conception of psychoanalysis. And this is very, very good, I think, for clinicians and all of us, really. Does not mean we should take no notice of the dominant tone in the most respective organizations, and what David had talked about. There's a certain kind of clinical allegiance to the group or the subject group, as Guattari said, etc. Consider Dr. Mendel and the doctors Stefan, the state of fury that is theirs and their literally police-like appeal at the thought that someone might claim to escape the Oedipal dragnet. You got to like their writing style in a certain way, Oedipus is one of those things that comes behind the more dangerous, all the more dangerous, the less people believe in it. Then the cops are there to replace the high priests. The first profound example of an analysis of the double bind in this sense, and this is crucial, I think, too, it can be found in Marx's On the Jewish Question. Between the family and the state, the Oedipus of familial authority and the Oedipus of social authority. And I would think, if you have a copy of the Jewish Question, early writing of Marx, which is a commentary on Bruno Bauer and Marx's, of course, insights into the limitation of Bauer's thing, you should reread it in this light. And also Sartre, in terms of the great book, a repeat of this on the Jewish Question in French, but translated as Anti-Semite and Jew, as a great, the double bind playing out. On the one hand, this, on the other pole, that, right? On the one hand, the familial responsibility, on the other side, the state. And it gives you a really nice move, I think, into, reading, what radicality Marx has in this context, too, in terms of undoing this Oedipal structure, etc., and for context. So Oedipus is completely useless except for tying off the unconscious on both sides. We shall see in what sense Oedipus is strictly undecidable, right? As the mathematicians would put it, we are extremely tired of those stories when one is said to be in good health because of Oedipus, sick from Oedipus, suffering from various illness under the influence of Oedipus. It sometimes happens that an analyst becomes fed up with this myth that is the bed and board of psychoanalysis and goes back to the sources. Freud never managed to escape, and this is open again to question. We can talk to David again next week, certainly Lydia, Jane, and others here about this, but Freud never managed to escape the world of the father or of guilt, while offering the possibility of constructing a logic of the relation to the father. He was the first to open a way from a release from the father's hold on man. This is interesting as one of Freud's great moments, that liberation, right? The possibility of living beyond the father's law, beyond all law, is perhaps the most essential possibility brought forth by Freudian psychoanalysis. But paradoxically, and perhaps because of Freud, everything leads us to conclude that this release made possible by psychoanalysis will be achieved, is already being achieved outside it. It's already going on outside the couch, outside the traditional psychoanalysis. So we cannot, and I'll conclude with this, we cannot, however, share either this pessimism or this optimism, for there is much optimism in thinking psychoanalysis makes possible a variable solution to Oedipus. Oedipus is like God, the father is like God. The problem is not resolved until we do away with both the problem and the solution. It is not the purpose of, again, schizoid analysis to resolve Oedipus. It does not intend to resolve it better than Oedipal psychoanalysis does. Its aim is to de-Oedipalize the unconscious in order to reach the real problems. And, we're getting somewhere. Schizoanalysis proposes to reach those regions of the orphan unconscious, and I like this phrase, the most pure contingency, the orphan consciousness, is very, very nice, a nice phrase, and indeed beyond all law, where the problem for Oedipus can no longer be raised. By the same token, we do not share the pessimism that constitutes in thinking that this change, this release, can be only achieved outside psychoanalysis. We believe, on the contrary, in the possibility of an internal reversal, right? And this is good, to those of you in the room practicing, that would make that analytic machine into an indispensable part of the revolutionary machinery. What is more, the objective conditions for such a practice seem to be present. So I'll leave it at that. I think this is a very crucial section, once again, both what schizoid analysis is, what its intention is. This is very serious stuff. It's a joyful book. It's fun. There are many, many levels of humor in here. This is really the beginning of the very serious attempts by them to do something radically different beyond just the critical smashing, if you will, and this review of the movement. So anyway, and then they go on to Lacan. So this section 4 to me is very important. So why don't we begin there next week, and we'll go on to the rest of we'll go into the holy familialism of psychoanalysis, right? If I look at the chapters going forward, we should have been up to about this stage now. We're going to go into the conjunctive synthesis of consumption and consummation, recapitulation of the syntheses that they did in terms of the connective, the disjunctive, and the conjunctive. And then we'll look at social psychic repression, and that's really a chapter on Wilhelm Reich, number 7. Then the difference of neurosis and perversion, psychosis, excuse me, and then the process itself, which ends with the English painter Turner. So anyway, I think we're hopefully in for a treat, reading this and a little more stuff. And thank you again, Beryl, for putting up Weekend. I really enjoyed going back to that, and I have Engels on my desk. I've been rereading both Morgan and Engels after looking at that great scene, and what a wonderful appropriation. Very creative and clever. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.